Buffy says, I'm pooped, like I'm tired. I don't know why she would say I'm pooped, but like she would never say that. But on the typewriter, I misspelled it. So it says I pooped. Like that's what I send in.
Welcome to Creative Insanity. Creative Insanity.
Hey guys, my name is Servant. I am a rap artist and producer out of Canada who's also an aspiring author. Today on the podcast, I have Crystal Bourque, who is a dark fantasy author also from Canada, best known for her novels in the Book of Eve series, but she's also a fantastic short story author who has published many stories, including her anthology, The Last Gardener. Crystal writes a short story for us called The Bone Setter that she reads and I follow up with a bit of critique. It's very well done, very entertaining, and I know you're going to love it. We also talk about how we both strived for professions in the wrong subject, how a passion like writing can continue to call you throughout your life even if you ignore it. And funnily enough, we get into how she might have legitimately, possibly, written the inspiration for a Buffy the Vampire Slayer episode. Joss Whedon, don't sue us. And on the whole, we examine the difference between books and film and how they inspire us individually and how as mediums differently impact the imagination. This is just a fun episode. Honestly, I try to make all my episodes entertaining and interesting to listen to, but they're also here to get you in the zone of creativity, for you to experience a bit of creativity, for you to listen to it, think about it, and get you feeling like you can do this too. Or if you haven't done it in a while, you can get back at it. So without further ado, I welcome you to this conversation. Let's get into it.
I'm ready.
You're ready. Okay, let's do it. Crystal Bourque, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited and pumped about this.
Yeah, me too. I'm even more pumped that you wrote a story for us.
I know. I'm very pumped I wrote a story too, because it's been a while since I've written a story. So I'm glad that this is my, I guess, first foray back into short stories. It's kind of awesome.
Yeah, it's been inspiration for myself as well, doing these story episodes. And I mean, Garrett, he was the first guy that we had on, and he wrote a story. It was like the first one he finished in a little while, though he was writing. And then he's just been writing ever since. And for me, I've been writing ever since. So yeah, there's something magical about having a deadline.
Oh, like definitely. I feel like that really helped. I also like that there's a little bit of a competition factor as well. You know that, like, you know, I'm waiting for your story or other people's stories. And if you don't get it done, might be a little, not that a huge amount of judgment, but like you want to make sure it's good. You want to make sure you get it done. And apparently I work really well with deadlines. So that was also a
yeah. Me too, oddly. I'm not a schedule guy, but I really struggle with it for some reason. But a deadline with friends expecting you to write to the same prompt, that makes me all kinds of competitive in a good way. Like, I'm going to make this happen. So.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's almost like if you want to go to the gym, but you need that buddy to go with you. Otherwise, you're not going to go. I guess writing is like working out some muscles, but not in the same way. But it's definitely more motivating, I find, for myself to have other people, I guess, working on the same thing or working towards the same goal. And it just definitely kind of kicks my butt into gear a little bit, which, again, super appreciated because I think I needed it.
Well, I'm glad. And it's also, I think, an interesting factor of these sorts of prompts that you have no idea what the other person's going to come up with. You're like, I'm going with this angle. I have, like, what angle are they going to take?
Exactly. And I think I was saying this to you before, but that's my absolute favorite part, because at least in my experience, anytime that I do this, I've never come across anyone who's written sort of the same thing. It's always completely different, and I'm more excited about that part, the part of like, well, what angle did you take, than almost what I'm writing sometimes, because it's kind of like insight into someone's brain, and that I find really fascinating. And that's why prompts are good, and that's why they work really, really well.
Yeah, I think writing in general, like the form of fiction is superior in some ways to other forms because it is the most like telepathy there is, right? You get to write giant swaths of a train of thought and craft it, and that exactly transplants into someone else's head. So you really do get inside someone else's head in a way, like in a much more intimate way than other forms, I find.
And I also love to just like stylistically, you get a huge snapshot into a writer's style of writing, and quite often it's so different from my own, and it's just, especially if you haven't read the writer's writing before, it's very unique to me because quite often being in your own head as a writer, you think kind of, I guess everybody kind of writes the same way, even though you read other fiction and you think, oh, there's different styles. But I like both elements, the different styles that come out and then the different ideas for the prompts. It's kind of magic. So as much as I often will not want to do a prompt, again, this was like a really good exercise, and it made me really excited about not only writing it, but also reading yours and seeing what you came up with.
Well, I appreciate it. And ditto. So before we get into your story, let's get into your story about into who you are as a person a bit, because I mean, I know you fairly well. I've known you for, is it 2 or 3 years?
Oh, I feel like it's been longer than that.
Maybe 3 years. 3 years minimum. Then I'd say 3 or 4. No,
it's been years tend to like blend into each other. I'm sure because we met.
It might be 4. It might be 4. Yeah. Yeah. Because
4. I'd say 4. We'll go with 4.
Okay, we'll say 4 years. That's pretty safe. It's been a while, and we've been part of the same writers group that has just been impossible to kill. It just keeps going on and on and on.
So good.
Mm-hmm. And it shifted to, like, it's not just a writers group, but I think it's a group of friends that we check up on each other once in a while. And
which is also good because I think, just to be a writers group, there is one thing about reading people's stories, but when it involves into, the friendships and the checking in and because life happens, it's our group is pretty special, I would say, for the 4 or 3 years that it's been.
However long it's been. We could scroll through the Facebook chat and just find out.
That would be a long scroll, but it would be, it would be good.
We've got some novels in there. So, but that's how I met you, right? And I got introduced to your fiction. I'd read a collection of your short stories. Right. I think that was the big body of work that I tackled, but I'm also aware you've written, is it a trilogy so far?
It's a trilogy so far. There's going to be 4 books total in this series. So I am working on the last book right now, but 3 are currently out. Yeah.
Cool. Tell me just a little bit. Give me a little pitch. Give me a little snippet of that. What's it about?
So it's, the title of the series is a Book of Eve series. So it's basically, it's Buffy the Vampire Slayer meets Angels and Demons. It plays with the creation story. So with Adam and Eve and what happened in the Garden of Eden. And basically this young woman has been reincarnated to basically save mankind from the original sin. But the thing is, she doesn't necessarily believe in God or angels and demons, at least at first. And so over the course of these 3 novels so far, it's basically a journey of her discovering who she is, what she can do. And then, it's going to end up with her hopefully saving the world. So pretty, I guess, challenging to tackle in terms of like first novels.
Right.
And I definitely, after this book is done, want to try and write a standalone novel because I think it's almost easy to write a series these days because, everybody's kind of doing it because it's at least in the indie sort of world, because the more books you have in this one world, and if people really love it, they love to continue reading.
Yeah.
And it's an easy way to I guess get people hooked and really into a series.
Mhm.
But it's also, depending on how you write and how long it takes to write, it can be quite, I guess I'm ready to move on to the
Right.
next.
Could be a bit exhausting maybe,
Yeah.
where you're like,
Yeah.
all right. So you feel like some of the novelty maybe for you, because you've been in it much more than the readers have, it starts to wear on you and you're like, I want to try new shores, right?
Yeah. Which is, I think, you develop a love-hate relationship with your characters, because, and especially after writing the third book, I definitely needed a break from them. I mean, some of them did things that I was not very happy with. So it's like, okay, book 4, like, how do we, how do we bring things back around? And so sometimes the break is necessary. And I'm falling in love with them again now that I'm working on the 4th book, and there's been some time in between and I know where it's going. But I don't think I'm going to try and extend the series in any way to say, oh no, now there's suddenly, like a 5th book. It will definitely end at the 4th. I think it's just a good place to end it. End of the world type thing.
Yeah.
So
cool.
Pretty place to end that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think what's interesting about series 2 is, even though you craft a story, each one, I'm sure, they have beginning, middle, and end. When you kind of bookend them together and it becomes a giant series, something about why, part of me said, when you said it's kind of easier for a lot of authors to want to get into series, because I just spilled my tea like splash. I don't know if you saw that. Yeah. Why it's easier for authors to like maybe tackle a series, which sounds counterintuitive, is because it's not whole until it's done, and there's like a beginning to a series, a middle of a series, and the end of a series. And that's when you can kind of judge a story, is when that last book is in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not to say that I don't like writing series. I think there's huge value to it. Because I kind of relate them to, I guess, like concept albums, where it's like you have to listen to the whole, you can listen to individual songs in the album, and they're kind of good on their own. But if you listen to the album as a whole, you get the bigger picture, and you're like, oh, okay, now I get this. I understand where the music is going, or where the writer is going with this. So definitely, I think series can have that same kind of feel to them, and it's not complete until it's actually complete. I guess part of it is the books that have 10, there's 10 books in the series, or even they're still writing books in the series. For me, I do have other ideas, and I do have other novels that I want to write. Mm-hmm. And I can only really work on one novel at a time with one set of characters. If I try and write another book simultaneously, it's not going to work for me. So I do want that change. So having a final moment in the series is really important to me.
Yeah.
And I guess that's just the way I write, or the way I work. Again, not to say anything's wrong with those.
Yeah, continuing and going on. But I think that it's nice too, because 4 books, that's a lot of meat for a reader to dive into. Yeah. And that's a very when you get to the end of that, you're going to feel, well, hopefully quite satisfied, right? But because it was a big sizable chunk. But
right.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you got to go where the muse calls you, and there are other shores. And some authors, they find that one series and they're like, this is the playground for me. This is where I'm going to spend the rest of my days. But I think others, there's a lot of playgrounds,
Yeah, which is exactly how I feel about it. And again, like with this one too, there is a natural ending to it. So it's the finish while it's still good. Don't have that 7th season if it's
yeah
the 11th season, just because you can have just end it when it naturally ends. And that's how I feel with my books.
That's cool. So yeah. How did you get into writing Tell me a bit about your creative journey. Like when you were a kid, did you want to be a writer? Like how did this come about?
Well, I always remember writing. I was the kid who had a diary. Not that any of the entries were like any good, other than like my sister was mean, that kind of thing.
Right.
And I guess my first real memory was in, I think it was grade 3. We had to write a short story, and we got to actually turn it into kind of a published book. So we got to like type it out, and we got to draw pictures for it, and then it was actually like bound, and you could make the cover and then the back and a dedication and just the whole just a book.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember thinking that was just so incredibly cool and neat to do. I don't think it registered then that like that could be an actual job that you could do,
right.
Writing. And my story was also completely copied. It was basically The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, just a circus, but and like a bear instead of a lion. And so, I mean, total plagiarism, but it definitely. It was a very imaginative story, and I remember the teacher kind of reacting in a way that was really positive and encouraging.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, when my mom went for the parent-teacher night, my teacher was the one who said, "Has she ever considered being a writer?" And so my mom kind of always kept bringing that up, I guess, over the years. And so it's always at the back of my mind, but I really wanted to be a singer and a classically trained singer. So I would write in secret and never show anybody anything. And then I went to university for music. I got that degree, and then realized that maybe it wasn't for me, the performing world. Which I guess is an expensive lesson to learn when you.
I suppose.
But at the same time, it still taught me, a lot of things. It's a good experience to have. And so after university, there was a lot of, I have no idea what to do with my life. I don't know what I'm doing.
Sounds familiar.
So I basically found some continuing education, creative writing courses, and signed up, and then started writing short stories and got a lot of encouragement there. And in fact, in one of my first courses, I submitted one of those stories and it got published.
Oh man.
So then, you kind of get those like bites of interest, and it really encourages you when your writing's getting accepted and published. So
yeah.
And then from there, it was kind of like, well, I actually really love doing this, which again, different from the singing. There wasn't that same kind of, I have to do this. It was more of like, I'm good at it. And not that it's easy, but it comes naturally to me. Whereas with writing, it's more like, I have to do it. I have to get these ideas out. And so I basically switched to writing and have been doing it ever since.
That's very interesting to me. That's really cool because we've got kind of similar backstories. I do rap music, and that kind of, for me, music was the easy thing. It was a thing that just always, like, I could do it. But then I wanted to be a writer, actually, as a kid. So it was kind of opposite. I wanted to be a writer. Everyone told me to be a musician or a singer-songwriter or something like that. Little did they know I would do rap. They wouldn't have encouraged it then. But
you play the piano? No, I'm a rapper. Thank you.
Yeah. So that was weird. But having the kind of love between these two mediums has been really interesting for me to navigate. And I've been going through a lot of growth recently in that department where, I mean, I went to university for psychology, but it was effectively to become a better writer. I thought a psychology degree would be more useful in me being a writer than an English degree, oddly. I thought
makes me though, that makes complete sense. Like because with the music degree, when you're being constantly judged on the thing that you do, that you think you do well, and
Yeah.
you're getting actual marks for it, it can be a little disheartening. Especially if you just end up with a professor or a teacher who just does not like what you do. And there's nothing you can do to change their mind. And then you're getting grades that are, it affects how you feel about the music or the writing. So the fact that you did a psychology degree, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Because it doesn't kill your love of writing. But psychology is absolutely critical in writing because it's how people think. And
yeah. So interesting story about that though. I did it for 2 years and then I dropped out. I
okay.
Yeah. Well, I studied it for 2 years and then I thought, well, maybe I ought to switch to English. Maybe because I was kind of spinning my wheels. I did very well at university actually, but then I stopped caring about it because I just wanted to write.
Yeah.
And music was like a fledgling thing. It was like I could always do music. Like maybe that's arrogance on my part, but it just always came naturally. I could do it. I liked it, but I didn't want it to be my job. I wanted writing to be my employment at that time. So then I went to university. Well, we moved to Edmonton from BC and I switched universities. I enrolled in a few English courses. I got married. And then I very promptly dropped out because I realized maybe it's not true for every class out there, but it was a very expensive book club. It was that's what it was. You know what? It was an expensive ass book club where they would be like, here, can you spend $100 to buy this thing that you can get at Chapters for $20?
Yeah.
And then read it and let's talk about it. And I can do that myself. I could do it with friends. I think
I love that. It's accurate. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, maybe if I had pursued more, I did some creative writing courses. I did a couple of them, but maybe if I pursued that much more intensely, I would have got more use out of it. But yeah, I thought at that point I'll get a Joe job and do what I love on the side and I'll moonlight. And that started to feel like a bad decision eventually, but that's my story. I think that it's cool that you kind of you're multi-talented. You have many things that you can do and that you're good at, but writing is the one that continues to call you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I get that sense from you as well. It's just that, it's the thing that I always did in secret. I just never really finished anything. And I mean, when I was, I forget how old, I wrote a script for Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Oh, really?
I put it up on a typewriter and I sent them a letter being like, I'm a huge fan. This was the ballsiest thing I ever did. And it was when I was 15. And they actually wrote a response being like, you're not on the writers, you're not in the Writers Guild, so we can't accept any of your scripts.
Oh.
But one of the episodes is very close to what my pitch is. Yeah. I'm not saying, please don't sue me, Buffy the Vampire Slayer people, but it's very close. And so, I always hold that as more of a, well, that's really cool. If I was 15 and I had an idea and one of the episodes is very, very similar.
Was it an idea that would have been hard to come by? Do you feel like,
That's a good question too. Maybe.
My wife has seen all the episodes. My wife loves Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Me, I got into Angel.
Okay.
Angel was my introduction, and I was like, oh, who's this Buffy chick? And why is he pining away at her? But my wife is the opposite. It was Buffy. So, if you said what the episode was, maybe you don't want to, but if you did, she would, know it. She would listen to this, and she would be like, oh, interesting.
Yeah, I'll tell you afterwards. So,
okay.
Again,
fair enough.
I don't want to be sued for claiming, because it's more the idea that it's the idea, my ideas are good, so just keep working at the writing and eventually you know.
Well, that's very validating.
Yeah. I mean, my script was horrible. The episode is
right.
way better. And funnily enough, I still have the script. I still have it. And one of the lines, it's so embarrassing. Buffy says, "I'm pooped." Like, I'm tired. I don't know why she would say I'm pooped, but like she would never say that. But on the typewriter, I misspelled it. So it says I pooped. Like, that's what I send in. So, I mean, just to fly wildly, like, no thanks. But
I remember that episode where she just, that's very funny.
Yeah, because I definitely proofread it. It definitely wasn't long enough. But again, the core of the idea,
Yeah.
niche, I'm like, that's there. So, yeah, I don't know where I was going with that story. It's funny. It's hilarious. But
I wonder, like, time frame, like from when you sent it in, when the episode came out in the series.
It's
like
a later season. It is a later season.
So it is later.
Episode. It was several years after. So again, someone else could have come up with the idea.
It could have been in the slosh pile. Like they could have, one of the writers, or someone could have been like, "Oh, this is kind of a cool idea. Like, let's bank that one." And they got a hat, and when they're sitting there, they're like, "What's Buffy gonna do this week?"
Yeah, we need an idea. Here it is. And so then again, I it's flattering if that's what happened.
But it gave you hope, regardless of whether it did, right?
Yeah, but that's sort of the like. I had to write it. I had to try. I had to, and that sort of thing. I mean, I think I've lost some of the ballsiness, and I often refer back to that story to be like, you did that when you were 15. Why, just keep going, keep trying. But it's, I am compelled to write, and I am compelled to try and share it and hope people will like what it is that I do. And then eventually someone picks it up out of the slush pile and is like, "Oh, this is a good idea. Here we go." So,
right.
Yeah, I imagine it's similar. Maybe you don't have as you didn't submit a script to Buffy, but
right. Well, I wrote a fan fiction actually for Twilight, and I was
not expecting to say Twilight. But.
Yeah, well, it was just erotica, right? And it was so successful that I actually had to change it so that it was. Sorry, I'm actually giving you the backstory to 50 Shades of Grey.
Yeah, but I mean, it worked for her, so. Yeah,
it worked for her. She had a Twilight fan fiction, and hey, I don't downplay fan fiction, but I attempted a bit of fan fiction. I have some behind me, these Stargate books.
Okay.
Like A Matter of Honor. Like these are, I think there was 13 of them. I'm missing 2 of them, and I was super into Stargate Sg-1. I've got these. That was my show. Like if Buffy was your show, Stargate was mine. And I remember reading one of these, but I was a young adult at this point, and I was thinking, someone wrote this. I could do that. I started a story, but then I think I gave up on that project. And I had other stories that I wanted to tell, so I didn't put too much stock into it. But I mean, fan fiction wise, I've done some music stuff that is kind of fan fiction. Like I did my Battle Angel thing, which I retold a film through the perspective of the main character's eyes, and that was kind of interesting. I love film. I get really inspired by film. Do you? You must.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I'd love to, again, aside from my Buffy the Vampire script, I have not really tackled any other scripts, but I would love to, because I think it's visual storytelling, and there's a lot of great TV and movies and things out there. And I actually find it really interesting that your rapping is a form of storytelling, and you use other mediums to tell a story or tell a story in a different way. And I find it fascinating, because I wouldn't be able to do that. Like I even though I have the music background, I'm not able to write anything near what you write and tell a story in the way that you do through music. So I think that's pretty incredible. And
well, thanks.
I sort of veered away from the question, but it's a unique way of using writing, um, and if you're really into film and you want to, I guess, honor that film or again tell a story in your own way, it's pretty awesome.
Yeah, it's amazing to me how we have more mediums of like different ways to take the drug of story, and
Yeah.
more so now. But there was kind of replicant ways in older times. Like people have been doing plays for a long time, and I mean, how ridiculous is the idea of a play? If you think about it, like at what point was society? They were like, you know what? I just want to pretend to be this person, and I'm going to get someone else to pretend, and you're going to enjoy the drama. It's a very cool thing, and that there's play, so it's a visual medium, and then there's props, and there's setting, like where are they telling the play, like the amphitheaters. There's so many cool ways that people would engage with things visually, but now film has it's auditory, like there's music. It's very encompassing. I think that film is probably the most immediate and urgent form of creativity because you can't help but partake in it. It fills your senses.
Yeah.
But, I think novel or reading, the written word, I think is much more immersive because it is, you can get so much more out of a novel than you can a book. Like it's so much bigger, it's so much more encompassing. You can understand from the eyes of a character in a way that you never can in film.
Right. Yeah.
And then, yeah.
Sorry, and I was just going to say if I read a book before I see the movie, I'm never going to enjoy it because it's never going to be what I've seen in my head.
Yeah.
Not going to be the same experience. So if I go into that movie, I literally have to be like, hey, Crystal, like, be cool. Like, it's not going to be the same. There's going to be some differences. Like, you just gotta, because otherwise I won't enjoy it because I'm expecting a certain scene that I really loved. And quite often that's
the one that gets cut. I know. Right? I watched The Martian. You ever see that one?
Yes. I haven't read the book though.
Yeah. So yeah, you like the movie, right? Like it's probably fine. But because I read the book and then I watched the movie was like, meh to me in comparison.
Okay. Yeah.
But there was like a specific line of dialogue in one scene in the book that was so freaking good. Yeah. And they had that same scene in the movie and they're going through it and the characters and they're kind of doing it in their own way. And I'm waiting for this line because it's like, I think it's like when one character tells the other to like fuck off or something. It's like, it's a big thing. And I'm waiting for it. And they cut before that were to have happened. And I'm like, in the book, it was better. And so like, that's one of the few times where I was like, what the hell? Like, I'm so robbed of this experience. But
were you in the theater at the time or?
Theater, yeah.
Okay, yeah. Because, you're in a theater, you can't really have the reaction. Like, I will literally yell at the TV if I'm at home. It's like this, like, what is this? This is garbage. Well, no, it's not garbage, but like I really wanted this scene. And I think it also comes to like being a kid and every summer, like my parents weren't big on watching TV or going to see movies. So it was go and read a book. So I would read so many books and develop that, like mental image and the immersive reading and like losing yourself in a book. And it's the thing that's stuck with me. So it's like if I read the book and then watch the movie, I usually have to wait some time in between. It's just I can't. I don't agree with a lot of their stylistic changes.
Well, what's interesting, I think, is that film has also influenced us as readers because we, us humble readers, we see a lot of film and we get a real sense of like cinematography, of what's beautiful. Like we as reading a book, I think our experience of film can inform our imagination of how to interpret the words. And if you think about like a screenplay writer, such as yourself, like
extensive experience as a screenwriter. Yeah.
Well, like a director, right? Like someone who's reading screenplays, they're reading words. they're reading a form of literature like a movie because their imagination is taking it to that cinematic level. And they're like, oh, yes, and Leonardo DiCaprio could come in and he could take his shirt off, and it's like they could visualize that. But the words are what cue them to visualize it. So these things kind of depend on each other. Like writing is the key ingredient for good film. You can't name a single good movie that has bad writing. Like writing is integral to everything. Maybe you can. Yeah. Can you?
Not off the top of my head, but I think too, like the script writing is very different as well because it's stripped of description. It's very bare bones because it is up to the director to have that vision. Well, they're almost the writer as well because they have to, when they're reading this bare bone, and I'm sure it's not bare bones to them, but if I were to read the script, it's this bare bones piece of paper with mostly dialogue on it and maybe a few cues, and they have to come up with this whole world that you have to see visually. And like you said, character point of view is so different and what you show is so different, that a good film in my opinion, like, it has to have good writing, but then that visual element has to be there as well, like the cinematography.
Yeah, it's so many more forms of art, right? Like you get costume designers, you get everybody coming together, like lighting techs. Like there's so many people involved in film to make that look beautiful.
Yeah. Whereas a writer is just it's all you, and it's on a page, and then there is some element of allowing the reader to build things in mind as well. And then a mark of a good writer as well is that factor of keeping someone immersed while they're reading words, which is sometimes more difficult than if you're being, when you see something, you're not really looking away from it as easily as you could with a book, because you can just kind of put it down.
A film can slap you in the face in a way, right? Like it can have a shocking sound and stuff. Like you could be watching a movie and go like, oh, and like a book can slap you in the face, but usually it's your wife who throws it at you. You know what I mean? No, let's say like you got to give some patience to a book. But speaking of, screenwriting being bare bones, the story that you wrote for the podcast today is called The Bone Setter, right?
It is, yes. That's my current working.
The Bone Setter. I thought that was a very, very cool title.
I think it is a title of a movie, though.
Is it?
But,
oh, well, you have to change it now.
Yeah, I know. No good now, apparently. But yeah.
Well, I think mine's also got the title of a movie.
Of a kids' TV show, which is very misleading.
Yes. Yeah, in my case. So I want you to read this story, but first we got to tell about the prompt. So I know in the introduction, I've already told everybody kind of what's going on, that there was a prompt that we shared and you and I both wrote to it, and we're both going to read our stories and kind of talk about our process. But I really enjoyed just kind of getting to know a bit of your perspective, getting to know you a little bit, and first, before people just jump into your work, kind of gives them a little bit more of the mind behind it. So
I hope I fill in the gaps.
I think you're going to do great. So what was our prompt? Do you have it handy?
Let me casually
I think I can say it. I think it's... No, I can't.
Hold on, I got it.
You got it?
Just give me... Okay. Whoever is delighted in solitude is either a wild beast or a god.
You're right. Isn't it whosoever?
I'm reading it off your email, so...
Don't. That's me. So yes. I typed that in wrong. So say it one more time, nice and slow.
Oh, no, you did write it whosoever. Sorry. That's
It was me.
Okay. Let's start from Mark 1.
Okay.
Whosoever is delighted in solitude is either a wild beast or a god.
Yes. And we came to that because we were on talking on the phone, and I was looking through some bad poetry, trying to come up with something. We settled
Yeah.
on the word wild at some point. We liked wild.
Yes. And then you just Googled wild and quotes, and then you
Yeah.
got the, yeah.
And this was a quote from Francis
Francis,
Bacon.
but originally from Aristotle, which I
Oh, really?
like a nerd after our phone
Oh,
call.
this is an Aristotle quote.
Yeah, it's Aristotle, and then Francis Bacon expanded on it in one of his essays. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Well, that was our inspiration, and not only was it us, but we actually had a low-key writers group. So there's
Yeah.
actually 5, possibly 6, if Garrett gets his story in the next couple of days. Writers that we've done this, and we're giving each other more critical feedback on the side. But today, we're going to get into yours. So,
Awesome.
whenever you're ready to read it.
Okay, I will do that. Hold on. Hopefully, I won't misread words like I just did. Because, anywho. Okay, so again, this is called The Bone Setter. The bone setter adjusted his sack of tools over his shoulder before he stepped from the solitude of his wood and into the village. The call that had set his head on fire, that he could no longer ignore, pointed him eastward. He allowed himself a single steadying breath before heading in its direction. The village was full of noise and dust, but the early morning sun made it difficult to see who crossed his path. Too loud, he thought, squinting against the glare. Too bright. With his free hand, he pulled the edges of his cloak tight against his chest. He lowered his head, hefted his sack a little higher over his shoulder, and continued east. When the bone setter reached a cottage at the very edge of the village, the call vibrated frantically, ringing like a bell only he could hear. Do not save this one. Death's grating voice didn't surprise the bone setter. He had been expecting to hear from his rival the moment the call startled him awake. I need to see the patient before I decide, the bone setter replied. You can't save them all. Death's voice came from somewhere over the bone setter's shoulder now. He didn't bother turning around. He knew he wouldn't even catch a glimpse of the Grim Reaper. He never did. I can try, the bone setter replied. The cottage door swung open and jolted the breath from the bone setter's lungs. A woman rushed toward him, concern etched in every line of her face, but her worry wasn't what set him on edge. The woman seemed familiar, but the bone setter couldn't figure out how or why. When the woman reached him, he wanted more than anything to tuck a stray strand of her golden chestnut hair behind her ear. His fingers tightened around his sack of tools and his cloak. I don't know her, he thought, more than a little alarmed. But you do, Death whispered into his ear. You came, the woman said, stealing his attention. I didn't think you would. The bone setter wanted to gather her up and breathe her in because it would help to wash away the stench of blood and fear and death. What is this? I can't. He can barely form a coherent thought. Before he could figure out why, the sharp pain in his head returned, screaming like a banshee in search of vengeance. Where? He asked the woman. The word came out like a rasp bark. He pretended not to see her flinch. Inside, she told him, and turned to lead him toward the cottage. The bone setter stared after her. He felt compelled to apologize, but wasn't sure what he wanted to apologize for. The woman made him want to slink back to the safety of his wood, and because the urge was so strong, the bone setter had to focus on why he had come. To answer the call, he thought. Go back, Death said. His words crawled across the back of the bone setter's neck. Leave this one to me. The bone setter ignored him, but couldn't stop the doubt from seeping into his resolve. As the woman and bone setter neared the cottage, a young girl peered out at them from behind the open door. Thin as a reed, she stared at him with wide eyes that seemed much too big for her face. He found the sight of her oddly familiar, much like the woman. Are you the man of the 7th hour? The girl called out. She didn't wait for him to answer before more words tumbled from her mouth. The butcher's boy says that you're going to heal my father. He also says you'll put me in your sack, steal me away, and... The woman deftly stepped out in front of her child. Out of the way, Kara, she said. The bone setter caught the shiver of fear in her voice. She turned to address him. You'll find Liam through there. The woman gestured to the back of the house with her chin. It was a boar that's done it. The thick, rancid stench of decaying flesh begged for the bone setter's attention. He stepped into the cottage, past the woman and child, and followed the sickly sweet scent into the bedroom. A fire burned in the hearth near the door. The bright light reached the bed that had been placed on the other side of the room. There, the bone setter saw a man, Liam, on his back with a bloody sheet laid out across his stomach and thighs. The bone setter moved forward, careful to keep his footfalls quiet and soft. "Do not be afraid," he said as he approached the bed. He knew his voice sounded anything but soothing. "I'm going to examine your wounds." Close enough now, the bone setter waited for a response. When none came, he gently peeled back the sheet. The wild animal had torn through Liam's flesh from thigh to gut. Without touching him, the bone setter assessed the cracked and exposed femur and the sausage-shaped innards that spilled from Liam's side out onto the mattress. "You would do well to walk away," Death told him, his breath toying with the string that secured the bone setter's sack of tools. "I told her not to call you." Liam's voice surprised the bone setter. He sounded strong, a good omen to be sure. He fights to live, the bone setter thought, and needed no more encouragement. Death would not take this man's soul, not when it could be saved. "You called me," the bone setter said aloud to Liam. "I'm sorry for wasting your time," Liam replied. He exhaled, a sharp sound that pierced the air like the crack of an axe against a tree. "He does not wish to be saved," Death snapped. "Let me be the judge," the bone setter thought, chiding Death as firmly as he dared. He turned his face toward the door. "I will need a chair," he called out. A moment later, Kara appeared with a short stool. Her gaze darted around the room and landed on everything except her father. The bone setter pointed at a spot on the floor beside the mattress. He lowered his sack and waited for her to set the stool down. Her wide-eyed gaze landed on him. "Can you fix him?" she whispered. Once again, the bone setter felt doubt poke at him like the repeated jab of a surgeon's needle. "See, you know I'm right." Death laughed, and the weight of it threw the bone setter off balance. He dropped his sack of tools to the floor and collapsed onto the stool. "I'm obligated to try," he said, although he didn't know if he meant the words to soothe Kara or whether he needed to hear them himself. "This one will chip away at what little humanity you have left." Death's voice felt like the sting of thousands of knives running down the bone setter's back. "Save yourself the anguish, give him to me." Liam interrupted any response the bone setter might have had by wrapping his fingers around his arm. Tell her I'm..." Liam trailed off, leaving the sentence to hang in the air between them. Ignoring his sack of tools, the bone setter knew of no earthly instrument that could save Liam now. He quickly laid both hands on Liam's body, one over the exposed and broken thigh bone, the other over the gaping wound on his side. The bone setter closed his eyes, focused on the call, and found Liam's pain. It hit the bone setter with the force of a winter's gale. The bone setter toppled into its depths. His muscles clenched, bracing for the moment of impact. It never arrived. Instead, Death grabbed the bone setter by the collar and jerked him sideways. He opened his eyes to find himself at the edge of the village in a clearing near the wood he called home. Liam and the woman stood in front of him, and the bone setter knew he stood within his patient's memory, Liam's memory. In a moment of blinding clarity, he knew he did not want to see it unfold. Too late. Take the pain, take his memory. It's how your gift works, is it not? Death's voice bulldozed through the bone setter's mind, the price he had to pay for his stubborn pride. The bone setter wanted to look away, but knew he couldn't argue with Death. Not this time. If he didn't accept the precious memory, he wouldn't be able to mend bone or muscle nor repair shredded flesh. Liam would surely die, and Death, a finicky deity at the best of times, would seek retribution for the bone setter's defiance. The bone setter stood with his feet braced against the ground and grudgingly accepted Liam's memory. "I have a child to consider," the woman said. "Surely you understand." "I would treat her as my own," Liam told her. "I would never send her away." The woman lifted her chin and crossed her arms over her chest. "But the girl is his," she said. Liam stepped forward. "Are you?" he asked, his voice quiet. The woman doesn't move. "No," she finally replied. "His work has changed him. He can no longer bear to live in the village. He's given Kara and me up." "Don't you want to be happy?" Liam asked. The bone setter watched the woman as she looked at Liam, his hands curled into fist at the unbridled love in her eyes. He remembered, and doing so only broke his heart as he had imagined had happened countless times before. He knows the woman because he's the one who's given the woman up. "I warned you." Death's searing kiss sent the bone setter reeling away from Liam's memory and back to his bedside. You did it, Kara's hush. You did it. Kara's hushed voice sounded like a reverent prayer in the bone setter's ear. He blinked and lifted his hands. Although his flesh is bright red, Liam's wounds have completely healed. Liam's memory, however, sits like bile in the back of the bone setter's throat. He feels a sharp pain in his side. His thigh bone creaked as he shifted his weight on the stool. He wanted nothing more than to hide, like a dog that needed to lick its wounds. Mama, it's all right, Kara shouted, her hand still on the bone setter's shoulders. He cannot bear to look at the woman, not now, and so he stumbled to his feet and focused on staying there as she entered the room. He watched her fall to her knees at Liam's side, and the memory he's taken swirls around in his head like a whirlpool. The woman gasped and turned to look at the bone setter with tear-filled eyes. Thank you, she said. She reached for his hand. The bone setter steps away from her. He swallowed hard as the memory faded and disappeared forever. Listen well, bone setter. Death's voice is gentle even as it is cruel. Even gods must pay a price. With shaking hands, the bone setter nodded at the woman and wondered why she and her child seemed so familiar. He grabbed his sack from where he had dropped it on the floor. He left his patient's bedside and stepped out of the cottage. Hefting his sack of tools over his shoulder, the bone setter ducked his head, pulled his cloak in tight, and returned to the solitude of his wood.
Oh, so good.
Thank you.
Yes. Oh,
Yay.
I loved hearing you read it too. It's so well paced. It's so well paced, like, and you can tell even just as you're reading it, it's sort of like when people are reading a story sometimes, they're actually reading it with like their internal voice is much the same as their external voice. They just don't realize that. And so like for you to, I don't know what the hell I'm saying there, but it's just like the pacing's great. The pacing.
No, and I mean, you mentioned this during our call where you and Garrett, when you were writing your stories, knowing that you're going to read it out loud definitely changes how you write the story as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think, because, I mean, even still, there's a few sentences where I'm like, man, I should have changed that. But at the same time, it really helped to influence the story and then help with better pacing because you're hearing it and then seeing it a little bit better than when it's just on the page and you're just reading it. And I already know what I'm trying to say, but hearing the words out loud helps to define in more detail, hopefully, for those listening, what I'm trying to convey.
Yeah, I 100% agree. In fact, I recommend as a practice for all writers, they should read aloud what they've written because as part of the edit is because you're going to go through and you're going to catch all sorts of things that you didn't catch because sorry, say that again.
No, I just said absolutely. I'm in 100% agreement.
Yeah. Well, okay. So first of all, I found it to be very sad. I felt quite sad for the bone setter. I caught more on this second, because this is my second time with this story, because I read it once, and then listening to you again, I picked up some more from the second in terms of foreshadowing that his memory issue, basically, or that there's going to be these exchanges of memory. Like the fact that he felt like apologizing as soon as he sees her. At first, I was kind of like, whatever. Like I guess that happens, but now it makes so much more sense, right? Like it's an interesting idea to have him be robbed of memories and to come in and have the residual feelings still there, and then he doesn't know why.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's a little like Eternal Sunshine of the, what is it? Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind?
Yeah, with Jim Carrey. That's right.
Which I wasn't my intention, but after it was finished, I was like, oh yeah, this really happens in the movie. Although there's no sort of like fantastical element
it's a very, very different. It's like sci-fi, the way that they eliminate these memories or whatever, so you can move on with your life. But in this, like you very clearly do lay out the rules of like what's the cost. And so the way I'm picturing it, the Bone Setter is he's like a minion, but he's like a god, but he's like a very he's not death. Like he's subservient to death. It seems
Yeah.
like he's very much like he's the Grim Reaper's. He kind of works. He works in opposition. So he has his own domain, and he follows the call. So he's a lesser god, is the way I would describe it. He seems like he's, god, or one of the bigger ones, the call or something, is what drives him forward, and he has a bit of wiggle room that he can be like, piss off, death. I got to work here.
Right.
But ultimately, what's interesting is that Death is trying to spare him a little bit. Death has got a soft spot for his little minion.
Yeah. I like complex relationships between. I mean, if you have a relationship with Death, it's gonna be complex, and so yeah, definitely there's that like love-hate relationship. But he's definitely I guess a minion, if you want to call him that, of Death.
Yeah,
sure.
like a lesser god, I guess, like a lesser being. But what's interesting is that it seems to indicate to me that he would have been like maybe mortal or something. Like there was something about him.
Yes, he is. So interestingly enough, with my drafts, like this is just a clear indication of how I write, where this is a very sparse draft. Like there's so much more that I wanted to add, and so much more to the story, but I don't think you wanted a novel. Like that's not what you
Right. Yeah, we had a word count we were aiming for.
Yeah. So I was trying to, I'm like, and that's also part of the competition to me. It's like, okay, 2,000 words, I can nail this.
You were 1950, right?
I know, I was good. So yeah, definitely the Bone Setter is mortal, but as he's working with his power and gaining confidence with his power, the line kind of blurs between where does he live? He lives in the woods because he can't live with.
Yeah, so, and he left the people and he left her. It was interesting to me the way you started the story. I thought quite masterfully. Like you raised a question. See, people have a bit of a what's the word? Like sometimes there's like a cult out there in terms of your first sentence, where people feel like your first sentence has to be so riddled with conflict, it's just bursting off the page. But in reality, you got the first few sentences. You have a few to kind of indicate there's something up, right? Because
I would, I find, well, and then especially in I guess a first draft, I often will go back and tackle that first sentence again, and try and make it more compelling. So I'm actually really happy that you said that. You like the beginning, because it's often the one thing that I have the most trouble with.
Oh, really?
Is the beginning. Yeah. So I will often leave it and I guess get feedback on it. And most people like, sometimes it's hit or miss, right? It's I find starting stories very difficult, and typically the rest kind of like falls into place. But the number of edits that happen at the beginning of something are so much more substantial than towards the end or even the middle.
Yeah, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but are you a bit of a discovery writer, like a bit of a pantser?
Yes, I'm a weird combination of both. I do have to outline. So for this story in particular, I basically went on a walk. The character of the Bone Setter I've had in my mind for a while. I had watched one of Brandon Sanderson's episodes. Where he's like, basically when you just mash together a bunch of ideas. So I was like, okay, what ideas do I already have that I can like mash together and make this work? And then basically like have a bunch of like outlined points, and then I'll start writing. But then as I'm writing, obviously like certain things won't work. I have to look at word count. So for example, I wanted his daughter to also have his power.
That's a whole subplot. Yeah.
Yeah. So like I wanted some of that in there. But then again, we only have so much time. So mayhaps a draft two. So I try not to let the outline dictate how the story turns out. It's more of a jumping off point for me.
Yeah.
Because, and then when I'm writing, I can feel that it's not working. I can feel that it's not, I don't know if that's a good way to describe it. Like,
No,
it's just,
well, it's like you had an idea of like when I get into this wood, when I get into this forest, this is what it's going to look like. But then you are discovering that you get there and you're like, oh, I was kind of right about this. It's kind of right about that. What's up with that mushroom? You know, like there are surprises for you still, but you still kind of are in a similar territory. So I would say that's kind of an interesting combination. And I do think ultimately everybody is a slight combination, because even like a pure pantser, someone like JH, where she like bullies her way, like she gets into it and her characters like tell her what's going on and she like follows the muse major, she still is going to get to the end of that draft and she's probably going to perk it up in little spots and there's going to be a bit of edits and she's going to have thoughts of, oh, I got to tweak this. And so that's kind of like outlining after, like, oh, I'm going to fix some things after.
Yeah. I think process is so individual to every author, because when you mentioned her process, the thought of trying to write something out without having I guess my beginning, middle, and end, I would just end up with a disaster. You would not have a story in 2 weeks.
Interesting. Yeah.
My wandering is just, I can't, I don't have any bone, like there's no bones for the muscle and the everything to hang on onto. So I've kind of just developed this thing where it's like, okay, have your beginning, middle, and end. Those things typically are just very visually strong for me. And because really it's a lot about connecting the dots between those pieces.
Yeah.
And that's not clear. You can pants your way around, around that. So it is interesting to try and put your process into.
Yeah, it's tough because you basically just kind of do it and you do it again and again and again. Like you've written so many times that there is an element of mystery into how this is all coming together, but you also kind of know this is the best way to get my butt in the chair. I got to go for a walk. I got to think about this. And you have a bit of process. And I feel like we're on a discovery of our process, much of us, for most of our writing life. And
I think, agree,
very few writers are like, this is what I do and this is how I do it. And these are the people who we don't like. We don't like those people. I'm just kidding.
Well, no, like I think it's such a different way of thinking, because I do know there's some authors out there who offer, this is how I outline, and I do this it's a super outline.
Even Brandon Sanderson, in the way that some of his description for those who don't know, Brandon Sanderson's a very popular fantasy writer whose writing I've never read, but I know everybody tells me I got to read it, but he's a very good teacher as well. And he's got some excellent resources. And I think for myself, Crystal, and our mutual friend Garrett and whatnot, I think we've all been diving into some of his lectures, and he's got some really good stuff there. So when he talks about his outlining process, sometimes it sounds like too rigid to me. It's like, you've got to do all this world building, but that's his, that's his playground. That's how he does it.
It works for him. I think if you're a novice writer, the idea is to be very flexible. Because I do remember trying to, if Brandon Sanderson is doing this, oh my God, I gotta, he knows what he's talking about. But I often find too much outlining. I then don't want to write the story because
it loses it. And for me, I am very strongly like that. I am a pantser. I am someone who just writes by the seat of my pants. And I often, in fact, most of the time with a short story, I have no idea what's going to happen till my butt is in the chair and it just starts happening.
Yeah.
But those few paragraphs is a kind of crafting for me, like where I'm like, oh, this is where I'm going to diverge. But we'll talk about my process later. I want to point out
a follow-up question, but it's okay. I'll ask it later.
Okay, sure. I want to point out a few other things I liked about this story. So the beginning was really good, because the first sentence isn't actually riddled with conflict, but it does raise a question. a little bit. Like, okay, he adjusts. So it's just like, who's the bone setter? And he's adjusting his tools and he's stepping out of the solitude of his wood and going into the village. So this little question there is, well, why is he going to the village, right? So it's a little bit of a lead in, but the next one is the call. It's the call. So the call that has set his head on fire that he could no longer ignore pointed him eastward. And so we're like, okay, what? What is this thing in his head? What's pointing him eastward? And then he has like this steady breath, like he sighs basically, and then he heads toward it. So it's like, there's the conflict. He has a call. He's like, all right, time's come. I've got to do it. But you're like, what's the bone setter going on this call? It's not explosive, but it raises a question. And that is a very good way to start a story. And yeah, and I think it kind of, this is a good example of something iconoclastic to the cult of, you got to have this powerful first sentence that just blows up, man. You know, it's just something.
That's a good voice. You should just
Thanks. This voice, the voice that I'm talking with now is actually my pretend voice. That's really how I sound. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I phased it out over time. I'm going to point out a few lines that I really like. What do I got here? Oh, so when you can't realize if you're listening to this is that all the dialogue between Death and the bone setter is in just italics, and it is not in quotations. So it's implied telepathy. He's basically communicating with Death in his mind. And so that's one of the disadvantages, I guess, of reading it out loud, is that you might miss that detail of, like, to see the language on the page, you realize that, oh, they have this kind of neural connection going on. So I just thought it was interesting that right off the hop, when Death says, do not save this one, that's your explosion. That's your big conflict. Death itself is like, don't save this one. Yeah. And that's only a couple paragraphs down. And so we're like, we got a question, we're going, and we're like, oh, Death don't want him to save this person. I found myself, and see, in the second read through, I actually found some sympathy for Death, right? Where I realized, oh, Death was kind of being nice. He was trying, or they were trying to save the bone setter from some anguish. But on my first read through, I was like, Death's a motherfucker. I was like, I didn't like Death.
And no, I love playing with that. I love playing with your impressions of characters when you first read them. I like the shift of where you realize what's actually happening, and then upon second reading, okay.
Yeah, especially for a short story, right? Like, to have a big ruse or something like that. Like in my episode with JH, I had a story where there was a reveal at the end. It was like a twist ending. Okay, and so, but it was about this length, so it was short, and we get to a certain point, and it was like, got you, tricked you. You thought it was this, but it's not that. Hard to do that in a novel, and when you do that,
it's masterful if you pull it off in a novel, because it's so much more setup, right? It's so much more.
So much more. And you don't, in a way with the novel, it's a way less likely chance that reader is going to put it down and pick it up again.
Yeah.
So as a novel writer, you know that it's like, if you're going to set up for this big reveal and then you have the reveal, you have to have enough in there that if they were going through it, they could have picked it up themselves, but not enough so that they feel cheated. Like, like there's a line.
Very careful balance. The payoff has to be real good. I find in novels, which is why I say it's masterful, because maybe it's not. Maybe I just think it's easier in short stories. But
I think that's fair to say. I mean, short stories are easier to write than a novel. Is that fair to say? Because
I would say that's accurate. It's
the principles. Again, the principles are the same. Many of the principles are the same in terms of conflict and pull in and character and setting and all that stuff. You still need to ground the reader.
Yes.
But a novel is, I think, in many ways harder because there's a lot more there. And that's just the simple of it. And like the high point of a novel, this high conflict scene, makes a great short story.
Yeah.
We have questions, but we're entertained. Yeah. But the novel itself, in my experience, I'd say is more work. But this is like, it's still, you're operating on the same principles.
Agreed. Yeah, absolutely.
So I have a huge check mark. Check marks are my way of, I like this line.
Nice. I like that.
Oh, this line. A woman rushed toward him, concern etched in every line of her face, but her worry wasn't what set him on edge. Like, it's so, like, I see her, and it's just like the etched on her face, but it's like, that's not what sets him off edge. And then you realize it's like, he feels like apologizing. And I just thought that was really a good line that sort of like jumped off the page for me. I wrote something here. Sometimes I try to guess where a story might be going.
Yeah.
And I wrote smoking gun, ? As I was going through it, where you mentioned that he knew he wouldn't even catch a glimpse of the Grim Reaper. He never did. And so I thought, smoking gun? Is he going to see him later? And I was wrong.
Yeah. Well, actually, I was tempted to rewrite it so that death is just constantly over his shoulder. Like the like just having the Grim Reaper over your shoulder constantly, like that kind of visual. But I did not have time for a rewrite. So I was just like, I'm just going to leave it and see how that goes. But I really also like that line. So I don't know if I'm going to change that or not.
Yeah, well, I feel like if you expanded it, if you were like, I'm going to jam another, because you said there's more that you feel you could put in here, you could maybe play with that dynamic a little more. I don't think that won't hurt the story. Okay. You probably are already aware, because these aren't finished drafts in the sense of like, this is when I get a writer on my podcast and we do that, I tell them this is a first solid draft. That's all it is. It's not, because if it's super prim and polished and you've already had someone go over it and feedback, then it's like it kind of robs some of the criticism that can happen. But I'm also, I'm not a nitpicker, but I will say there was only 2 times I think I could find where your tense shifted.
Yes.
You noticed that?
I initially wrote it in the different tense.
You wrote in present tense and then switched? Yeah. Oh, and yeah, that happens. You don't catch it.
I don't usually write in present tense. And so then I started reading it and I kept switching back and forth. So I was like, oh, I'll switch it to past, which I'm used to writing in. And then I missed a bunch of them. And then I confused myself. So, you know,
yeah. Like for people who don't know what I mean by tense, the line is, for instance, like the woman seemed familiar, but the bone setter can't figure out how or why. So everything is past tense. So a woman rushed towards him in the past, concern etched in the past in every line of her face, but her worry wasn't in the past what set him on edge. The woman seemed familiar, but the bone setter can't present. Right? Yeah. So that's what when I say tense, that's what I mean. For people who don't know, I know you know, but
well, yeah, and I definitely missed a few. So
just a couple that I caught, but I think on the first one you corrected verbally what I have written.
Yeah, because I've been practicing it, and I was like, "Oh, Crystal, you missed these guys."
Yeah, all so right. You're fully aware then, so that's cool. Another line I have 2 check marks is, before he can figure out why, the sharp pain in his head returned, screaming like a banshee in search of vengeance. I was like, whoa, like, yeah, that line had some steam. That was like, boom, like that's intense. So I just really love that. Awesome. Thin as a reed. I really like that description of Kara.
Yeah.
Thin as a reed. She stared at him with wide eyes that seemed too big for her face. I just thought that was cool. So the man of the 7th hour, I didn't know what that meant exactly. And on second read through, I was like, there's some lore here that's going on. And what I came to, my conclusion in the second was, and tell me if I'm off, but his daughter, okay, yeah. So his daughter, the girl, Kara, who's the daughter of the woman whose house he's called to, and to fix her new partner, Liam, basically. She's like, oh, are you the man of the 7th hour? And she's like, the butcher boy says you're going to heal my father. He also says you're going to put me in your sack and steal me away. And like, at first I was like, what's she talking about? But on the second through, I was like, you know what it is? It's like, there is a kind of lore and mythology and like rumors and stuff that people say. And they know, the town peoples know that this is the man who knocked up the woman. This is the man who gave birth to the child. And so the fact that she was desperate enough, like, to call on him, or to somehow, for the call to send him there, like, to bring him there to heal her new lover, so to speak, is sort of tragic in and of itself. And that the daughter knows that this is like, she wouldn't necessarily know that it's her father, is my impression, but that's the butcher boy might know, and the town might know, or something. It's like there's a dynamic there that's really interesting, and it's a whole layer of how terrible. Like, the woman maybe, or the butcher, they're under the impression that for the bone setter to come in, there's an exchange. You want me to fix your father? Give me your child. Like, that's messed up. But tell me how off I am about that.
So your interpretation is really interesting. So again, this is an effect of me cutting a lot of stuff. So the Man of the Seventh Hour, it's actually, so my background is Acadian, so French Canadian. And there is folklore about the Man of the Seventh Hour, or Bonhomme Septer. And it's basically, he's a bone setter. He comes to people's houses.
What? Really?
However, like, he carries a sack and he has his tools in his sack. But in order to, like, get your kids to go to sleep before, like, at an appropriate time, they would say, if you're not in bed by 7 o'clock, the Man of the Seventh Hour is going to come and put you in a sack and steal you away.
French are so weird.
And take you back to the woods and, like, eat you, and you'll never return. You know, so, like, fairy tale, like Grimm's brother kind of deal, but for French Canadian history. Yeah. So I've always wanted to, and this is where I'm talking about, like, I wanted to mash different ideas together. I wanted to write about this, but in a different, my own take on it.
Yeah.
And so that's what that is. So in the village, everybody knows who he is. They know he is the healer. He is the bone setter. And the call is when someone is injured, he comes to heal. But also there's that lore around, Kara doesn't know that he's actually her father.
Yeah, I wasn't sure. I didn't think so based on that comment.
Yeah, well, it's definitely something that likely needs further clarification. But it's the lore that these kids have in the village, where it's this man in a cloak who comes out of the forest with a sack over his shoulders.
Yeah, it's Jim.
It's Jim. Oh, Jim.
Every town's got one.
Yeah, that's fine. But it's that, I was just trying to wrap that folklore kind of into the story. Yeah,
that's really cool.
And so obviously expanding on that, I think would add a lot to the story. So yeah.
Okay. That's really cool. Yeah. So I had a question about that, but another line I really loved was, he knew his voice sounded anything but soothing. He speaks very little in this story. And it's like, I can hear him, I can see him. And it's like, that was just a really good direction there. I have fuck you, death. I wrote that. So
that's awesome. That's
at the save your anguish, give him to me. So, like, even at that point, like, I cared enough. Yeah, where I was like, come on, death. Like, what's your big deal? I also wrote ooh with lots of O's.
Oh, nice.
That's my the plot thickens.
Okay. Yeah.
So, I thought there was a very interesting and magical description of the healing that I thought you did really well. Probably your experience, like, writing in the fantasy genre has served you well, because I'm not a fantasy reader much. I don't often read fantasies. This is actually helping convert me into the possibility of maybe there's something I would really like out of fantasy, or maybe there's something I could do with fantasy. So
that's a good compliment, because I mean, I could also get the opposite of I don't.
I've been getting more and more intrigued with fantasy. Another prompt that we did, I forget which one, but we had a writer in our low-key writers group, Chelsea Murray, not Chelsea Quasi, that's her maiden name. She wrote a fantasy short story, and it kind of got me thinking, like, oh, like, I never write fantasy. Like, so I was thinking that, and I read this one, so it's like, oh man, there's even, like, don't be surprised if my next prompt is a fantasy. Like, I don't know if I'm up for it, but the healing process you described really well. I'm just going to read these couple of lines.
Sure.
So, like, he ignoring his sack of tools, Yada yada. He quickly laid both hands on Liam's body, one over the exposed and broken thigh bone, the other over the gaping wound on his side. The bone setter closed his eyes, focused on the call, and found Liam's pain. It hit the bone setter with the force of a winter's gale. The bone setter toppled into its depths, his muscles clenched, bracing for the moment of impact. And the next paragraph, it never arrived. I was like, that's like mystical and interesting. It opens up this, because it's almost like scientific in a sense that like what he's doing is he's sitting there and this is his process. But I can so strongly visualize that it's like he's in another place entirely and he's getting hit with this pain. It was just really cool. It really like got my imagination going.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's because I wanted to keep sort of the, I guess, medical kind of side to it. And then describing the magic is always really critical in fantasy, just because
Right.
you need to see what's happening. And that can be incredibly challenging sometimes. But I really do like how I wrote that.
Good. You should.
Yeah. I'm with myself on that one. So
Yeah, it was good. Like, yeah, very like strong imagery. Another line that I feel like, I don't know how naturally this came out of you, but this is a very, very important line in terms of stage direction. Liam and the woman stood in front of him, and the bone setter knew he stood within his patient's memory, Liam's memory. In a moment of blinding clarity, he knew he did not want to see it unfold. Like, I feel like my instinct as a writer would have been to somehow try to like strictly show it and see if the reader could come to that conclusion on their own. But that would have been a failed attempt, and I would have been frustrated at trying to find the right sentence to kind of be like, this is what's going on. This is technically a bit of exposition, but this is very good exposition because you would have confused everybody if you didn't have that in there.
Yeah, it's a lesson learned over time, definitely, because I think a lot of times as a writer, I'm trying to be really clever about how I describe things, but in that particular scene, I definitely had that thought of if I do not explain that this is memory and that this is a very specific thing, like nobody's gonna get it. I can't be sort of ethereal about it. It has to be very direct and to the point. Otherwise, I'm going to lose everybody.
Yeah.
So a very deliberate decision. Yeah.
And
absolutely.
in terms of exposition, like you don't have all that much, but it's quite balanced. Like exposition, for people who don't know, is when you are explaining like the rules or the dynamic of a story. You're kind of like, Soren said, "You crazy bitch. He said this because yesterday she did this to him." And, it's like you kind of go on and you're just like explaining the story or the things that you need to know to understand the story. But when those little sentences come up, it's just a little bit here, a little bit there. And it's like it comes through unnoticed. And that's very masterful. If you had a big old chunk of exposition, so let me tell you about death and why death is hanging over this guy's shoulder. It robs the person of the moment. It robs them out of the story. So you know what you're doing.
Well, thank you. Again, I mean, the word count limit really...
And yeah, it's a challenge for fantasy in particular. Because there's often...
So it's like every word has to count. If it doesn't matter, like take it out if it doesn't matter. Direct. And then you can always expand later when you know.
Absolutely, yeah. Like you could 100% make this bigger.
Yeah.
Now, I have one story question that I felt like I don't know what you think of this, and I don't know if this is just my inclination as a storyteller inserting myself, and so it's not good critique to give you.
Okay.
But he visits this painful memory, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the bone setter immediately loses the memory. I found afterward, like right towards the end, he swallowed hard as the memory faded and disappeared forever. And then, listen well, bone setter. Death's voice is gentle, even as it is cruel. Even gods must pay a price. But I thought, what if would it be more impactful possibly if he has to somehow live with these memories? But then I also realized that kind of means that he would probably have memories that if he's coming in. So it kind of like there's something there that doesn't quite work.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think
because he has this memory, and it's like, whoa, like
yeah,
that's the price. Even gods have a price. But then I just thought about it. It's like, well, in a way, maybe he doesn't have the weight of that price for long because he doesn't remember ultimately.
I think I need to make it more clear that it's more a deliberate choice on his part to get rid of
so
get rid of the memory. Like because it's so painful for him that he has to take on this pain. He has to take on these painful memories.
Oh yeah. What if it's like he's got to like stuff the memory down, kind of thing? Like he's got to take
it. He's just making a nice old ball of just pushing it out of sight, out of mind.
And you could that's like a line you could maybe add or something, and you could be like stuff it down or something like all the rest. It could be implying that this is why his memories are so buried deep. Like that, I don't know, that connection you made right there, I feel like would keep the impact for me.
Yeah, because it's not only, he's healing different people too. And he's taking their pain. He's taking a memory that is likely extremely sad or difficult. And it's part of why he lives in the woods. He's just, it's overwhelming. He can't live with these people because he has to take that on. So yeah, definitely clarifying that I is a good suggestion. So thank you for pointing that out.
No problem. I think, that would probably be like the only suggestion that I had, but like, and the other suggestion I guess I would say is like, this to me seems like one for sure you could expand on if you wanted to make into something bigger, because it's like, it's an interesting world and a dynamic, and I feel like there's more story that you could tell, but for the word count of where it's at, you hit it right like a hammer on the nail. You did an excellent job.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Is there any questions you have for me? Is there anything else you'd like me to comment on?
I think you hit all the things that I was thinking about too, or the lines that I enjoyed. The ending was, excellent point. And I really do want to expand this one because again, it was really fun to write. And I think I got something, I got a kernel of something that can be really, really good, really interesting. Could be a novella, could be a novel. We don't know, but it was fun to visit another world and some other characters for a little while. And take that break from the novel. So.
That's good. And it's good as it is. Like, you don't have to expand it.
Right.
You don't have to. But if you enjoyed it, if you like that playground, I feel like I wouldn't warn you against playing in it some more, is what I'd say. Yeah.
Yeah. I do this thing. I do let my short stories sit for a little bit, and then I come back to them for a couple of weeks. And then I also have to sort through what I want to add.
Right.
But the places where you've kind of mentioned where it's like a little bit unclear, like with the daughter, with the man of the seventh hour, those are all places where I know I can expand on, and that's kind of the plan. So it's good that you as the reader pointed it out, because it does mean, I need to
there's more juice you can squeeze there.
Yeah. Exactly. So
well, thank you very much for reading this story. I thought it was excellent. And speaking of juice to squeeze, that's what you do. That's what you do when you want to segue, by the way, and you have no way. You just take whatever they said, and then you just say what you're going to say. Right.
Noted. I'm going to use that next time.
It works for literally anything. Literally anything.
I love it.
You just repeat what they said. Speaking of that, this is what I was thinking. And they'll be like, what? So I do feel like this is a good place to end the episode, because we had a nice introduction. We had your story. Now, there is still my story to come, and we're going to get into that on next week or next 2 weeks. I haven't decided if I'm doing these every 2 weeks or every week, but when the next episode comes out, it'll be part 2 with Crystal Bourque, and we'll be reading my story to the same prompt and getting her feedback for me, and getting into some even more interesting stuff for writers and people who are creative of all sorts. So where can people find you if they're looking for you or your books?
You can find me at crystalbourque.com. I can spell my name, CrystalBourque. You can also find me on Amazon and on Kobo. My books are available in both ebook form and in paperback.
Yeah. And I highly encourage people to read it because Crystal's a fantastic writer. And we're going to hear more from her next week. Thank you for listening to today's podcast. If you found any of this valuable, please consider subscribing, recommending this to a friend, or leaving a positive review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you happen to be listening. If you watch this on my Servant YouTube channel or Facebook page, please leave a comment and share. I love to hear from my listeners and learn from them. Learn more about me at www.servant.com. That's SRVENT.com. Thank you again for your time. Now go be creative and sane.